Let's consider the framework of industrial design. Engineering calls upon a positivistic tradition of the scientific method, where we measure things and we use data to drive design, but also to interpret the nature of reality. And if you look at philosophical foundations, the ontological and epistemological foundations for industrial design, where we're looking at what is the nature of being and how we know what we know and how we acquire knowledge. If you consider Immanuel Kant, his writings on the nature of matter can be a helpful starting point, where there's a delineation between the essence of an object and what you perceive the object to be. So if you look out a window and see a rock, you actually don't see a rock. You see a certain shape and color and the inference of the rock, and your brain puts together all these sensory inputs to say that's a rock. But you're actually, that's different than what the rock is. So in the positivistic tradition of science and engineering, you're using the scientific method to understand the nature of being. So if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. In the humanist tradition, if you look at constructivism and the interpretive nature of that realm, it's a framework that says that I run all data, all sensory perception through myself or through something. And that process is a little fuzzy. It's subject to many things that can't be described, although in the social sciences we try hard to describe them. And Pascal said that the heart knows what the mind does not, something to that effect. And it's the notion that we know what we like, even though it can be difficult to describe, but we do try to describe it. So an industrial designer will tap into both frameworks, so the constructivist framework and the positivistic framework, to pursue design. And what that means is, again, these terms are always a bit unnecessarily bordering. So you've got this sort of scientist and this artist and these pressure points between the two, but it's helpful to look at what the foundation for that is. So whereby the scientist would say, I want to measure things and I want to get develop a hypothesis and test that hypothesis and repeat that test to achieve a certitude about the results and the relationship between parameters and these kind of things. The social scientist would step back and say, who is this that's measuring things? Who is this that's interpreting data? What is the framework for them interpreting that data? What's their positionality with respect to the data, and all these sorts of things. So in some ways that's just an overview of the conflicting approaches that you encounter when you deal with design, because you're dealing with usability, how well does a thing work or the system work, and that's really important. But you're dealing with something broader. You're looking at material culture, heritage, you're looking at visual stereotypes, you're looking at this relationship between the person and the object and how that reflects upon their self-identification, upon their society, upon their culture, upon the things that they value. So objects carry value beyond usability. And some of these are quite hidden, and therefore industrial designers will use ethnography. They'll study people, and they'll tap into the social sciences to get some really good, rich, textured data on products, on things, on systems. How do people really use things? They don't always say how they use them. You have to watch them. You have to ask them certain questions. You have to have the eye of an ethnographer to pick out these points, and it's a really powerful tool. And in turn, though, industrial designers will tap into the sciences with alacrity. We'll take anthropometric data and say this is what the measure of the person is. This is data. If you want to make a chair or make a tool or make a car or make a mobile device, this is the dimensions of the people. We'll look at kinesiology. These are the movements that the people can make. We'll look at ergonomics, a kind of broader sense of here's the relationship between the amount of pressure a person can apply and their range of motion. And those are scientific pursuits. We'll also look at mechanical engineering. We'll look at impact. What does that do? What about stress concentrations? What's fatigue? What are all these factors that come into play that actually make something work? We'll tap right into that as well. We'll tap into art, so we'll look at elements of design, which are in some ways rigidly formulated. I mean, we know about the notion of symmetry and harmony and balance and all these elements of design that come into play in industrial design as well. It's part of the tool belt. We can look at other fields of, for example, control systems. It's difficult to design something without an electronic interface, so you have to be somewhat familiar with that as well. So industrial design taps into whatever needs to be tapped into. It's interdisciplinary. It looks at primarily at the human relationship with a product or a system and says, how do I acquire this? Unlike the fine arts, where we're looking at self-expression, we're saying, here's my art, this is what I'm trying to say, and it's sort of a communication between the artist and the viewer. But industrial design is a commercial endeavor. It's not self-expression. It's driven by things like brand management. It's driven by things like material culture, visual stereotypes, things I mentioned before, things that almost have to come into play to make a product commercially successful. It's got to work. And it's got to carry the brand appeal that has been arduously protected by the company. It has to have maybe a surprising element like poetry. It has to surprise the user and compel them to buy this thing in a crowded marketplace. So that's part of industrial design as well. And when I think about the framework, the starting point for industrial design, it's helpful to think about the nature of data. In other words, how am I going to start with this blank sheet of paper? What are my starting points? And in that regard, you can look at things such as visual stereotype, which is what people are used to seeing. And I think a good example of that is an American pickup truck. The proportions of that truck haven't changed much in about 40 years or longer, and that's what people expect to see. And the same is true with a sports car or a stapler or whatever device you're thinking of. So you have kind of one bit of data to work with. Another, of course, is anthropometric data, the dimensions of people. So if you're designing a chair, there's some kind of hard and fast rules to say these dimensions are required to fit a person. You can look at brand management, so you could have color schemes, although that's sort of waning with the increased customization available to people now, at least at the consumer product level. And you can look at engineering. You know, it's got to be this thick for it to work. Or you can look at materials, and if you're worried about corrosion or safety issues related to children and such, there's certain materials that you're limited to. Of course, these things don't start the design process. And what I really wanted to look at was the framework for design. But you can see those sort of positivistic things can come into play. And they're coupled with the artistic, which you're not going to describe on a videotape. That's something deep and personal and something you bring to the table. And creativity is a really interesting area because it's hard to define. There are certain denotations out there that point to creative expression being an expression which is unique and surprising and has some value, so that this differentiates it between a children's scribble and a Matisse painting. So these are some measures of creativity. One of the most helpful ones is the notion of surprise, where people look at something and they're surprised at what they see. In the artistic realm, it's easy to irritate people and make people angry. That's, in my view, one of the easiest ways to elicit an emotion is to anger people by offending something. A more difficult emotion to evoke is happiness or hope or some of these sort of abstract values that are harder to come at. But that's in the world of art, expressing creativity. And you funnel that into this bizarrely shaped funnel of the industrial designer to produce a product that's appealing and that works. It's real important that it works. And if you ignore cultural anthropology, if you ignore ethnography, that subset, if you ignore the social sciences and statistics and these kind of measures, you lose a lot of things in your tool belt. So at the end of the day, there's no perfect design, there's no perfect process, there's a lot of words bantered about as to what might be the optimal process, whether it's affinity diagrams or mind maps or storyboards or whatever the latest fashion is. But the process of ideation is a wonderful process, and it's full of human qualities that are hard to describe. How did Mozart compose? How did Picasso paint? These are hard things to parse, and maybe the process of trying to unpack those destroys them. It's an interesting exercise, but it falls into this human realm that is preserved for humans. We do things that we don't understand, and we connect dots that we don't appreciate, and it's an interesting pursuit.